Good morning, everybody. I am Rebecca Winthrop. I am a senior fellow here at Brookings and the director of the Center for Universal Education. It's a real treat to have you all join us. We have a fantastic panel. It's the day after Labor Day? Not quite. What are we, 2 days after Labor Day? Back to school. The world is back to school, certainly in our country. And what a good way to start off the back to school season with an event. The title of which you all know, but we're talking about why doctors and mayors will be the next playful learning advocates and new evidence to support children's education and development. There's been a number of recent studies come out over the last couple weeks that we'll be talking about. I will kick off, the way we're going to run it, I'll kick off and frame a bit, and we will have two of our panelists, Michael and Kathy, come up and share some of the evidence from those studies, and then we'll have a discussion and then open it up to Q&A for all of you before we close. It's a real treat to welcome to Brookings, to the Brookings stage, these four wonderful colleagues. I'll start our token male, Michael Yugman. You all have in-depth bios in your packet, so I'm not going to go through every last wonderful thing that they've done. But briefly, Michael is both a pediatrician and on the faculty and an academic. And actually, all of our panelists straddle the sort of practitioner academic line in some ways. He's the chief of the Division of Ambulatory Pediatrics at Mount Auburn Hospital. He's also on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, and he also has been playing a leadership role in the Boston Children's Museum, formerly the chair of the board, now the leading up the advisory board. And so we'll speak from a doctor and museum and sort of community engagement perspective. Next to him, we have Rosemary Trujillo, who is the Senior Vice President of Curriculum and Content at Sesame Workshop. We have her in large part to thank for the wonderful programming that our kids get to watch, for any of you who have young kids, and the fantastic stories. She also has an academic background, previously on the faculty of Teachers College at Columbia University. And next to Rosemary is Kathy Hirsh-Pasek, who's one of our own. She's a senior fellow here at Brookings at the Center for Universal Education. And she also wears many hats, most especially is the Stanley and Deborah Lefkowitz Faculty Fellow at the Department of Psychology at Temple University. It's a mouthful. She runs the Infant Language Laboratory, so she has a whole lab on the science of child development, which is a treat if you ever get to visit her, which I enjoy doing, and is currently working quite a bit, not only with the William Penn Foundation, but the City of Philadelphia and a range of other groups in Philadelphia to try to make Philadelphia the first playful learning city through an approach we're going to hear a lot more about. And last but not least, on the end, we have Katherine Stephens, who is a fellow think tank scholar like myself, just neighbors from AEI. And she also is a scholar practitioner. She has deep expertise in the education sector, doing quite a bit on teacher development, and a former preschool teacher, so can really speak from experience from the trenches. So we're pleased to have all of them here. And the reason we were really especially interested in doing this this panel right on our back to school week is because we've been thinking a lot at the Center for Universal Education. For those of you who don't know us that well, we've been thinking a lot about learning and education and skills and competency development for across the lifespan, but particularly for children and youth. And one of the things we've been working quite a bit on is this idea of how do we define success? What is it we're looking for? And we certainly, I think, would argue that there is a quorum of agreement within the education and child development field that we really want children who have a broad suite of competencies. They need rigorous academic skills and abilities. You want highly literate adults and people who are good at scientific reasoning, but you also want folks who are good at solving problems with others, who can collaborate with colleagues, who can have empathy for others in another situation, who can regulate their emotions, who can come up with ideas and solutions to problems we don't even know exist yet. So we talk about that as kind of the idea of a breadth of skills. There's lots of terms in the education field. The economists talk about cognitive and non-cognitive, and the psychologists will say that's ridiculous, everything is cognitive. And some talk about social and emotional learning, and then you have the business people talking about 21st century skills. It doesn't really matter. What we're talking about is academic plus. We know we need rigorous academic skills, but much more than that. And we've been thinking quite a bit about the crisis globally, that our learning systems, our education systems are really not fit for purpose. They're really not preparing young people for that to develop those breadth of skills. One particular study coming out of the Education Commission put forward a statistic which is horrifying to me and will be horrifying to you and horrifying already to those who know it, which is that if we don't really do anything differently, certainly in the education space, in 2030, so that's getting much closer than we think, over 800 million youth will not have the very basic secondary level skills in literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and problem solving. And that's very basic. That's a huge amount of young people who we're not helping prepare for the future. And that is a gap that is not just in poor countries around the world. We focus a lot on poor countries around the world. It's certainly a gap right here in the United States, in poor communities, in communities where kids do not have quality education opportunities. So there's a big inequity in how we're preparing our young people to be able to thrive in the future, both in work, life, and citizenship. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in myself is thinking about, well, how do we leapfrog? How do we make much more rapid progress? You know, if we don't have an education system that is truly fit for purpose for all kids, what are the things we can do differently? I've put out a book called Leapfrogging Inequality a couple months ago, and in it, I really argue that playful learning approaches, and you can use whatever term you like. I like the term playful learning approaches because it reminds us that children are born learning and they learn through playing, and that it's the education system. We might need to adapt to the natural way kids learn, but it's basically this idea of student-driven, experimental, iterative, social, meaningful education approaches. You have to make space for them in children's learning opportunities. Direct instruction and lectures are also really important. We're not saying replace one with the other. You get different things for them. But if you want young people to not just have rigorous academic expertise, but this broad suite of skills, you need to make space for playful learning. And for us, trying to think about, we've been doing a lot of thinking about how could you do that? How could you do that in education systems in a way that much more rapidly allows kids to develop these skills? How do you, quote unquote, leapfrog? And one of the ways that we've identified, we looked at 3,000 education innovations in over 150 countries, and one of the ways we identified is that people are beginning to really diversify the people in places where children's learning takes place. So break down, if you will, the lines between sort of the school and the community and think much more holistically. So a whole society approach to whole child development, if you will. And that is really what we're here to talk about today, is really how can we think differently about children's learning and development towards this goal of breadth of skills outside of just the walls of the school. And after all, kids, certainly in the US, and it's more or less the same in different countries, only spend about 20% of their waking hours in school between 0 and 18. So you've got 80% of waking hours who are spent outside. I see some like furrowed brows. When I first heard that, I was like, is that possible? My kids are always in school. What do you mean? But if you add up after school, before school, weekends, before they get into school, at age, maybe it's preschool 3, summers, it really is the vast majority of their waking hours is outside school. So how can we think much more creatively about the types of learning and developmental activities that we can curate for our children. And one of the things that we've noted as a community who cares about children and learning is that children's free time and time to play in the U.S. has gone down drastically. In the report that Michael and Kathy have co-authored, and you hopefully have gotten a copy at the front, it's the Power of Play, a Pediatric Role in Enhancing Development in Young Children, and most importantly, it's a clinical report from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and carries quite a bit of weight. And they cite that between 1981 and 1997, playtime for kids went down 25%. And they also note that 30% of kindergartens in the U.S. do not have recess. So 30% of kindergartners, these are 5-year-olds, 4 or 5-year-olds, depending, don't have any recess. There's also so we really are at a crisis in terms of what we're letting our kids do. There's also a recent study and report that came out from the UK Children's Commissioner. They have a Children's Commissioner, which I love that idea, really citing a deep crisis in children's health, both mental health and physical health, and point to the shrinking ability of young kids to play, particularly outside. And so we're going to hear quite a bit from Michael and Kathy about why play is important and what they found in their study, and then have a discussion about what we could do about it, thinking about sort of diversifying people and places and across actors in society. So with that, I invite you up, Michael, and then you, Kathy.
I just hit the arrows to advance the slides?
What's that?
I just hit the arrows to advance the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you. It's really quite an honor to be here at Brookings talking about this work. My focus in this paper is on early childhood, because that's been my love for years. And it grew out of experiences I had at the Boston Children's Museum, really observing the joy when parents and children were actively playing, and realizing that that was one of the few places where they could safely engage with a diverse group of kids from all socioeconomic backgrounds. And that led to my seizing the opportunity to really make a value statement on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I'm proud that they were willing to support this. I'll start off with a couple of quotes that I think capture the breadth of this issue. The Museum of Modern Art in New York had an exhibit a couple of years ago called The Century of the Child, and I love the quote from their book. It's plays to the 21st century what work was to industrialization. It demonstrates a way of knowing, doing, and creating value. I also love an old quote that many of you probably know from George Bernard Shaw, who said, "We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing." So, and lastly, much to our surprise, in Sunday's New York Times, one of the op-eds was about the value of play in reversing the decline of liberal democracy and overt partisanship. So Kathy and I were both astounded that the way this is extended. So let me going to talk about 3 points today. One is that play with caregivers, peers, teachers, and the broader community is brain building. It enhances brain structure and function. Secondly, that as Rebecca mentioned, playful learning is a fundamental part of healthy development and is crucial for 21st century skills such as executive function, collaboration, and innovation. And finally, and this I think is really powerful, we know about the importance of relationships, but I think play helps build the safe, nurturing relationships with all caregivers that mitigate toxic stress and promote resilience. So, I won't go into great detail, but a lot of animal data that's hypothesis generating for humans, but that play influences brain anatomy, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which are the seat of executive function skills, and dendritic complexity neuronal growth factor, and even epigenetic changes in the brain-derived neural growth factor genes. So, as Rebecca mentioned, the characteristics of play: intrinsically motivated, child-directed, active, engaging, and meaningful. Joyful discovery. I think we really want to emphasize the joy and the agency that children experience when they're playing, and often socially interactive. Now, there are various categories of play, but I just want to highlight one specific category: attunement. So attunement was a concept originally promulgated by Daniel Stern and Barry Brazelton around the 3 to 4 month social interactions, the serve and return turn-taking, that are the basis for the pragmatics of later language development that parents and children experience in the first few months of life, both mothers and fathers. Object play, obviously play with not necessarily fancy toys, but play with leftover dishes, with Tupperware, with wooden spoons. Kids can be incredibly imaginative at how they explore the properties of objects. Physical play, outdoor play, rough and tumble play. Sadly, playgrounds are increasingly unsafe, and children have lost a lot of opportunities to play in safe playgrounds. And the opportunity for kids to take safe risks and to learn how to engage in rough and tumble play without hurting each other, and the coping that comes with that, I think is also a factor in the increasing rate of obesity in our culture. Imaginary play and storytelling. I think not enough to just read, but for kids to be able to tell stories to each other about what they're reading and to their parents. Kathy will talk in much more detail about guided play and playful learning. And again, back to outdoor play and its importance for, there's a book called The Nature Deficit Disorder for kids that don't go outside. Again, another categorization of play: who initiates, who directs, and whether or not there's an explicit learning goal. Kathy will talk more about this, but I just want to make the distinction between the first three categories and direct instruction, which is all directed and initiated by adults, which is the predominant mode of education, unfortunately, in our schools right now. Now, we talk about 21st century skills. So we want to emphasize not only cognitive and language skills, but play helps with the negotiating, the social emotional skills, the self-regulation skills that build executive function, task persistence, problem solving, and building this pro-social brain that we think is so critical. And again, you can see it captures this construct called the whole child. Now, when we talk about the future, it relates both to that New York Times op-ed article, but it also relates to surveys of CEOs about what they want in a future workforce. They want employees that are not only smart and have the basic cognitive skills, but they want employees that can work together in teams and problem solve and collaborate and be creative and be innovative. And these are exactly the kind of skills that play helps cultivate. So, we talked about its effect on brain function. We talked about its effect on skill development. My third point was that play promotes safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. Again, the best example is the serve and return interactions, the attunement that parents and children experience during play, the shared communication and mutual joy. The way play empowers parents in a guilt-free way to become better observers of nonverbal cues in their children during play is really a very kind of empowering way to support their interactions. And we know those kinds of interactions and relationships can really mitigate the body's stress response. Just an example of attunement. And what we're really talking about here is the opportunity and possibility of play really mitigating toxic stress or adversity and promoting resilience. So in the presence of childhood adversity, the role of play, especially social play, becomes even more important. One of the important constructs that's gotten a lot of press in the last 10 to 12 years has been this concept of different levels of stress response. Obviously, the CDC study about the prevalence of adversity and trauma in people's histories and its effect on both childhood morbidity and on long-term adult adverse health outcomes makes the distinction between positive stress, which is adaptive and coping and pretty ubiquitous here in Washington, tolerable stress, buffered by support, as opposed to toxic stress, is what we're most concerned about. Prolonged activation of stress response systems that influences not only neuronal circuitry, but inflammatory mediators, the immune system, even probably the microbiome, in the absence of protective relationships. And here's where play and the protective relationships can be incredibly buffering. And when we look at the prevalence, the increasing prevalence of anxiety and depression in not only high school students and college students, but in middle school students, one can think about the importance of playful relationships and mitigating those kinds of mental health adverse outcomes. So our paper created a prescription telling a value statement, basically suggesting that parents remember to play with their children every day. And it's a way to, as I say, engage parents in playful interactions without involving guilt. It's a value statement. It's basically saying, trust your common sense, watch your child. And this is a broader perspective on improving outcomes for children, reducing stress, strengthening core life skills, supporting responsive relationships, and I think play has a role in all three domains. So, want to turn the mic over to my colleague, Kathy, who will talk about the balance in curriculum, the opportunities for playful learning throughout urban neighborhoods, and the variety of contexts in which we can really provide opportunities for playful learning.
Well, hi, everyone. Are you ready to play? So what I want to talk to you about now is something that's really going to sound different. This is leapfrogging at its best, going out of the box to think of things you never thought about before, and how we might take the idea of play and work it right into our communities and our neighborhoods. And we're calling this initiative Learning Landscapes. Now, in our pediatrics report, Michael already mentioned that we talk about different kinds of play. And we think, or we can think about play as existing on a kind of continuum, from free play through guided play to games, and then non-play. Non-play would be when you have something that is initiated by an adult and when it's directed by the adult. Kids need not apply. But you can have environments where something is initiated by a child and directed by the child. That's when the child goes into the living room and builds the fort. And you can also have the most wonderful places on earth, children's museums, or Montessori schools, or places where an adult builds a fabulous environment, but the child gets to be the discoverer and the explorer. And when that happens, we have found in the scientific literature, the science of learning, that we then can optimize learning goals while still having a very playful environment. And we call that environment guided play. Now, the literature so far, and it's a growing literature, so I don't want you to think it's slam dunk at this point, but it turns out that when you have a learning goal in mind, guided play seems to be quite effective in helping increase language outcomes, reading outcomes, math outcomes, spatial thinking, and executive function outcomes. So we wondered, could we infuse guided play with a learning goal into these everyday spaces in our world? Could we literally shape environments architecturally so that the kind of behavior that you got in those environments stimulated guided play? Now, as Rebecca already told you, after all, kids are only spending 20% of their time in school. And we know there are huge gaps between the under-resourced neighborhoods and more over-resourced neighborhoods. So maybe, just maybe, we could use learning landscapes as a way to supplement what's going on in the schools and to help children get just the experiences they need to have brain-building moments. The initiative would sit at the juncture of early education, going up all the way through, I would argue, even adulthood, but starting in early education, and where it meets the global cities movement. And sitting right there at the development of family-friendly cities and education could be something we would call learning landscapes. Now, this all started one day when I was sitting at home and wondering, when is a bench not a bench? Like, why does a bench have to be that, right? Couldn't a bench have puzzles on it? Couldn't a bench have games on it? Couldn't you do something with a bench? And when I started there, I then made a phone call to someone who I heard was an architect starting something called the Conscious Cities movement. The conscious cities, how can we make cities more aware of the people who live in them and give them more opportunities? So it was with that we created a vision. And I'm going to try to make this work. I just hit it like this. Oh, it worked. Oh my God. I'm not technoplegic anymore.
Learning landscapes lies at the juncture of the global cities movement and of early education, and we embrace the science of learning to help every single child have the greatest potential to succeed. It's about redoing cities and finding opportunities where we can have a little more fun and a little more learning going on. We are at the Please Touch Museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is Parkopolis, a human-sized board game to help kids play with and learn about math and science.
When we were developing Parkopolis, we did a deep dive in the literature to pull out what are the most important things that young children need to be learning for science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM skills.
It feeds deeply into our commitment as a leading 21st century children's museum to be a partner in research that is helping the world understand how and when children learn best.
The science of Playberry, it's about finding ways to build in more literacy, to enhance language skills.
A lot has changed. The aesthetic changed. It's a lot brighter in here now. There's more of a circular atmosphere, so the children come in, sit down, see what the books are, climb the wall. Physical development adds for a mental improvement. It allows them to understand about setting goals, accomplishing those goals, which goes into school.
It gets kids to want to come to the library.
Playwall is a giant chalkboard wall that says, when I was little, I loved to play. And then it prompts people to write down however they loved to play when they were little.
People walk up and they'll read the question and they'll think, what's something I played when I was a kid? And then you'll see them smile because now they're in touch with a memory. Okay. And they'll write it down, and it kind of seems like it makes their day good.
What we know is that when people are talking about play, they start to understand the connection between play and learning.
Urban Thinkscape is a project that attempts to take places in the world and turn them into opportunities for parents and children to talk to each other and to engage in playful learning together.
This project, it was introduced in the Belmont community, and everyone's hands went up. I want it, I want it, I want it.
Urban Thinkscape is to take public spaces like bus stops and transform them so that it is imbued with learning opportunities.
There are 4 installations. The point of Puzzle Wall is that it's going to foster spatial skills, and we know that spatial skills are important for later math skills. There's 2 different runs of jumping feet. And then we have a little sign that suggests, okay, can you put 1 foot where there's 2 feet and 2 feet where there's 1 foot? So that's building some executive function skills.
The big vision for learning landscapes is a very big vision. We are looking for opportunities to take the everyday and make it extraordinary.
So you might be wondering, so what happens when you do something this crazy? And today I'm going to share some of the very first results with all of you. Now, the first project we did was called the Ultimate Block Party. And we went into New York City and we kind of took over the central part of Central Park. We had 28 different scientifically inspired activities, and people came from all over. We had a huge reach, over 10 million people, and the results were that when parents played in guided play environments with their children, they started to see the value of play for learning. After visiting just 3 of the 28 exhibits. Experiment 2, you just saw a snippet of it here. The supermarket study. In Supermarket Speaks, what we did is we put up signs. And these signs were just prompts in the supermarket. Some days they were up, "Hi, I'm a cow." I know they're stupid signs, but they worked. "I'm a cow. I have milk. What else has milk?" And all of a sudden, the parents and kids started talking about milk. They had conversations. Indeed, in our research in the low-income neighborhoods, the conversation level went up by 33% when the signs were up, as opposed to when the prompt signs were down. Example 3, Urban Thinkscape. In Urban Thinkscape, which was our bus stop, we compared what happened at this bus stop with a local playground, just to see whether we were encouraging the right kind of stuff. And here are the first results. Increase in parent-child interaction over our control site. Increase in language use by the children, and our targeted language use, spatial language, numerical language, which are the building blocks, brain builders for math and science and STEM, went up. That's amazing that it happened just out there at a bus stop. Parkopolis. Parkopolis was designed to spark STEM, but so too was our control site, where we were looking at rocket building. And we wondered, would the kids end up using more number language? Would they actually talk about fractions with our fraction dice? See how we changed it? 1 to 6 and then 1 with fractions? Then you had to deal with fractions. What would happen? Compared to the rocket exhibit, yep, the kids were more involved, used more of the numerical language, did more problem solving, made more predictions, and had more hypotheses in Parkopolis than they did in the rocket building. And finally, what's going on in Playberry? Please notice that in Playberry, when you're climbing that wall, you can actually spell out words. And the kids actually do. What did we find? More interaction among adults and kids, more number and spatial language talk, and the parents put their cell phones down. That was cool. So, across the experiments so far, I think we've learned that we can indeed encourage guided play in public spaces through architectural design. We just need to be clever about it, and we need to make sure that we preserve the integrity of the science as we do those designs. And in fact, for anyone interested, we've just come up with a playbook that I'm happy to share from Philadelphia, where it shows you our thinking as we go through the design process. We can enhance that other 80% with informal learning, and parents and children can increase the brain-building moments that are going to lead to math, to STEM, to reading. So it's all very exciting. We've been expanding and scaling. We've been rethinking what jails could look like in Madison, Wisconsin, hospital waiting rooms in Philadelphia. We are doing a park in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya right now. So join us in dreaming and thinking about what we can do as we go out of the box. Also working with groups like Urban 95. And then I just encourage you, as a bottom line, to say we really can make a difference if we just ask, when is a bench not a bench?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.